It's good to see you all. We're going to dive right in because the lesson I have prepared is far too long to squeeze in the small amount of time I have today, so we are going to be blasting through. So we'll open up with a quick word of prayer, and then we'll jump in. Dear Lord, thank you for this day, and thank you for this opportunity that we have to study your word, to be reminded of some things this morning. I pray that we're looking for those truths, that we're not rushing through too much. I pray that you give me clarity of mind, that you enable me to speak what you've laid upon my heart, and that everything I do and say honors and glorifies you this morning. Pray this in Jesus' name, amen. If you will, turn in your Bibles to the book of Esther. The book of Esther. If you're not sure where to find it, it is after the book of Nehemiah. The book of Esther, as far as Bible order of the books, it always feels so random and out of place for me. I always skip right past it. If you find yourself in the book of Job, then just turn a few pages back. You'll eventually hit Esther too. So somewhere in between. The book of Esther starts out not with the person of Esther, but instead the king Ahasuerus. And he's having this great, big celebration. He's having a feast. They're having a great time. It goes on for 7 days. And at the same time, his queen, Vashti, is also having a feast. And they get to a point, and the king decides, hey, I want Vashti to come to my feast so I can show off her beauty. She's just the most beautiful queen that anyone could ever have. So he sends some people to go get Queen Vashti, and Queen Vashti was like, no, not today. I don't think I'm going to go to the king. I'm good. I'm having my own party. Not doing it. I'd rather not be around all you guys. Which brings up a problem. Well, what do you do with a queen that defies the king? And he asks his wise men, what am I supposed to do with this? And they say, well, if you don't kick her out, if you don't banish her, then all the other wives are going to stop submitting to their husbands, and we're going to have a riot on our hands. There's going to be so many problems. And so your best course of action, just banish her from the kingdom. Kick her out. Get rid of her. And then we'll figure out what to do after that. So that's what King Ahasuerus does. He kicks Queen Vashti out, but now there's a vacancy. They need a queen. And so they go around, they start finding all the beautiful women in the kingdom, and they start preparing them. It is a very, very lengthy process to prepare them to go meet the king. But eventually, that time comes. And later, when we get to chapter 2, we find that they found one of those women, and that was Hadassah, or also known as Esther. Verse 7 of chapter 2 says, and he brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother, and the maid was fair and beautiful, whom Mordecai, when her father and son and mother were dead, took for his own daughter. Now, if you were just mildly triggered by the way I said Mordecai, I have recently discovered, accidentally and horrifyingly, that is the proper pronunciation of his name. Mordecai is kind of like the shorthand. I'm much more used to Mordecai, so I might be flipping in between the two, but it's technically supposed to be Mordecai. Facts you didn't know. I want us to notice this morning first, the first life lesson from the story of Esther, is that Mordecai and Esther did not choose their circumstances. Esther's parents were dead. That is not a circumstance she chose to have. She was being raised by her cousin. We don't know the reason why her parents were dead. The Bible doesn't give that. Some believe that it may have been during the time when the Israelites were taken captive. During this time when the Persians were in control, there was a heavy persecution against the Jewish people. They were still hated while they were in captivity, so it's possible they died through that way. We don't know the exact reason, but we know Esther's parents are dead. And that's not a decision that Esther made. She probably wouldn't have chosen for her parents to be dead. They probably wouldn't, Mordecai and Esther probably wouldn't have chosen to be in captivity. This was a judgment against Israel for their sin, but Mordecai and Esther did not necessarily choose to be in captivity. That was the judgment of God. That was out of their control. The last circumstance that they didn't have within their control was that the king was searching for a new queen, and that he was going to soon pick Esther. The circumstances that they found themselves were out of their control. But as you read through this story, you don't read about how they despised that. You don't read about how Mordecai and Esther complained constantly about, oh, my parents are dead. Oh, the king wants you as his queen. Like, that's just so wrong. They didn't have control over these circumstances, and they didn't burden themselves with the lack of control. Instead, they took control of the one area that they could. They could still choose to remain faithful to God despite their circumstances. And that's what they chose. As you read through the story of Esther, you come across a story toward the end. Let me see if I can find it because I forgot to write it in my notes. And I thought I was thorough. I must have missed this one. So they go through, they get chosen by the queen, and Esther gets chosen by the king. In chapter 3, is that chapter 3? No. I skipped. It's right before chapter 3. Aha, my notes lie. Okay, so in chapter 2, verse 21, small hiccup, it says, in those days, while Mordecai sat in the king's gate, two of the king's chamberlains, Bigthan and Teresh, of those who kept the door, were wroth and sought to lay hand on the king Ahasuerus. And the thing was known to Mordecai, who told it unto Esther the queen, and Esther certified the king thereof in Mordecai's name. And when inquisition was made of the matter, it was found out. Therefore they were both hanged on a tree and were written in the book of the Chronicles before the king. So the first thing we notice at the beginning of the story of Esther, and we're going to see it over and over, Mordecai and Esther, they don't control their circumstances. They can't micromanage every area, but they do control one area, and that's to remain faithful to God throughout the entirety of it. But the second thing they don't do is they don't sit idly by. When Mordecai and Esther are presented and given and put in situations where they need to make a decision, they don't sit back. Mordecai finds himself in a situation, we're going to find out later, that God has placed him in this spot. He's overheard this plot against the king for a very specific reason. Mordecai doesn't know that this is going to come up and be important later, but he hears this plan to assassinate the king. These two chamberlains are extremely angry. They want to take him out. Mordecai valued the role that God had placed him in, the place he had placed him. God placed Mordecai in the right spot to hear it. It would have been easy for Mordecai to rationalize not telling the king. They were in captivity. The Jewish people were probably not very fond of the Persians. They wanted to go back to their own land. But Mordecai didn't hold his bitterness against the king. He could have, but he didn't. What had the king ever done for Mordecai? Like, he could have just chosen, hey, he's not, showed favor to me. I'm just gonna let this happen. Maybe a new king will bring about something better. Maybe we'll be favored more. He could have showed apathy. He could have shown no compassion. But even in a land where his people were persecuted, he took an action that would save the king's life. He told Esther, hey, these people are going to try to kill the king. You need to tell the king. So Esther goes, she tells the king. And through that, they're thwarted. They're caught, they're captured, they're hanged. And then that story almost completely dies. Like, there's literally nothing else written about it for a long time. It's kind of just like, oh, yay, Mordecai saved the king. Moving on. Not much is set in. But Mordecai saved the king, perhaps because he understood that it wasn't up to him to see who was to stay in power. God sets up rulers in power. It's not up to us to take them out. Romans chapter 13, verse 1 and 2 says, "Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power of God, and there's no power but of God, and the powers that be are ordained of God. Whosoever thereof resisteth the power, resisteth the ordinance of God. And they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation." Perhaps Mordecai understood that it wasn't his decision whether or not Ahasuerus was to stay as king. It didn't matter how Ahasuerus treated him. We're not necessarily told that Ahasuerus was part of the persecution, but that wasn't Mordecai's decision. He knew something was going to happen to the king, and because God had placed him in a position where he could do something to save a life, it was his responsibility to continue it. Life matters no matter who the person is. Psalm 139, we're familiar with it. It says, "I will praise thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are thy works, and that my soul knoweth right well." That verse doesn't just apply to the unborn. That verse doesn't apply to just us. That applies to every single person. Every single person in the world is fearfully and wonderfully made. And no matter how much you may dislike someone, their life is still important to God. So in this situation, Mordecai didn't sit idly by when placed in a situation with a plot against a king. He took action. We as a church shouldn't sit idly by. There's things happening all around us. There's people around us. We find ourselves in situations that we don't have control over. But we can always take action to show the love of Christ, to care for people, to show them love. We can take action. We don't have to sit and just wait for things to get better. Often God places us in difficult situations so that we can exhibit his character and magnify him so that other people come to know him. But then another situation came up. In chapter 3, Ahasuerus promotes Haman into a position of power. Chapter 3, verse 1 says, "After these things did King Ahasuerus promote Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and advanced him and set his seat above all the princes that were with him. And all the king's servants that were in the king's gate bowed and reverenced Haman, for the king had commanded concerning him. But Mordecai bowed not, nor did him reverence." Mordecai perhaps saw bowing to Haman as an act of idolatry, and he was not going to give in. That troubled the servants of Haman. If you notice in verse 3, Haman hasn't noticed Mordecai yet. "Then the king's servants which were in the king's gate said unto Mordecai, Why transgressest thou the king's commandment?" They want to know, "Mordecai, why won't you bow to Haman?" Well, Haman wouldn't give in. "And they spoke daily unto him," it says in verse 4, "but he would not hearken to them." And eventually they were just like, it's time to tell Haman. It's time to tell Haman that this Jew is not, bowing and giving him reverence. Well, Haman, who had been completely oblivious up to this point, suddenly takes note, and he's just filled. The Bible says in verse 5, "When Haman saw that Mordecai bowed not, nor did him reverence, then was Haman full of wrath." And this wrath grew into such an extreme hatred that it says in verse 6 that he thought scorn to lay hands on Mordecai alone. For they had showed him the people of Mordecai. Wherefore Haman sought to destroy all the Jews that were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, even the people of Mordecai. This wrath against Mordecai, this disdain for him that Haman had, just kept growing bigger and bigger. And at first it was just like, I'm going to take out Mordecai. I can't see him prosper anymore. And eventually it grew so strong that he's like, no, I'm going to take out every Jewish person in this kingdom. Wrath takes us farther than we can ever imagine, and we must keep those emotions in check. We cannot allow anger to control us. There's lots of things that can be very aggravating to us. And sometimes there's sin, which we do need to be angry about. But remember to keep your anger focused upon the sin. Don't turn it toward hatred for people. Well, things progressed, and Haman hatched a plan. He hatched a plan to lie to the king Ahasuerus, and he convinced him that, there's a people group. There's a people group in your kingdom. They're a huge threat to you. In verse 8, it says, Haman said unto King Ahasuerus, there is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of thy kingdom, and their laws are diverse from all the people. The Jewish people were nothing like anyone around them. They had very strange laws. They couldn't do certain things that people were just like, but why? So Haman says, their laws are diverse. There's this people. They don't keep your laws, neither keep they the king's laws. Therefore, it is not for the king's profit to suffer them. Ahasuerus, you're not going to profit. You're not going to get any gain if these people continue. We need to wipe them out. And King Ahasuerus, who's thinking this is a great threat, is like, okay, you can have my ring, sign it into law. The days of the Jewish people are now numbered. We get to chapter 4. Mordecai sees what is done. He knows that this is an attack against the Jewish people. Chapter 4, verse 1 says, when Mordecai perceived all that was done, Mordecai rent his clothes and put on sackcloth with ashes. A sign of great distress, sign of great mourning. He went into the midst of the city and cried with a loud and bitter cry, and came before the king's gate, for none might enter into the king's gate clothed with sackcloth. And in every province, whithersoever the king's commandment and his decree came, there was great mourning among the Jews, and fasting, and weeping, and wailing. And many lay in sackcloth and ashes. The Jewish people were not oblivious to what was happening. They knew this attack was against them, and they knew that they were helpless to stop it. Another circumstance completely out of their control. Now, Mordecai could have sat around and just said, well, this is out of my control. I can't do anything. Clearly, we're all just going to die. Haman's got power. Haman has, the king is on Haman's side. It's just hopeless. I'll go cry the rest of my days and then I'll die. But within his mourning, he saw that perhaps the hand of God could move. He still had trust that God had promised them that they would still return back to Israel. And instead of complaining, instead of wallowing in his misery about how the entire Persian kingdom was against them, he went to Esther. He cried before the gate to the point that the servants of Esther came to Esther and they're like, hey, Mordecai is crying before the gate. It's kind of getting loud. And Esther was like, oh, goodness, my cousin, I'm going to be the embarrassment of everybody. So in verse 4, so Esther's maids and her chamberlains came and told her and then was the queen exceedingly grieved. And she sent raiment to clothe Mordecai and take away his sackcloth from him. But he received it not. She's trying to comfort him. She's trying to be like, don't make a scene. This is okay. We'll be fine. Maybe she thought he was an embarrassment to her. Maybe she just felt uncomfortable with this. And she tried to tell him, look, it'll be fine. We'll be okay. But eventually, she asked an important question, which should be the first question whenever we see someone in distress. She asked, "What's wrong? What's wrong, Mordecai? Why are you so upset?" And he begins to explain the plot of Haman, a plot that would destroy the Jewish people, a plot that would be difficult to break because Haman had promised that much of the spoil from the Israelites would go into the treasury of the king. But he had a solution. He had a possible way that Esther could help, and that perhaps that they could go to the king and beg for mercy. There's no doubt that Esther would have been concerned for her people. She was Jewish. She wasn't a traitor. But she knew the consequences. She knew what Mordecai was asking, to go into the king and to ask him, "Hey, can you save my people?" She knew what that might cost. In verse 11, she details those. She says, everybody knows this. Chapter 4, verse 11, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces do know that whosoever, whether man or woman, doesn't matter who you are, shall come unto the king into the inner court, who is not called, there is one law of his to put him to death. You can't go in without invitation, Mordecai. If I go in, I'm going to die. Except such to whom the king shall hold out the golden scepter, that he may live. But I have not been called to come into the king these 30 days. Mordecai, I know what you want me to do, but I haven't been called by the king, and to go in there is to commit suicide. I'm not guaranteed that he'll hold out his scepter. I don't even know if he still likes me. It's been 30 days since I've seen him. If she were to enter without invitation, she knew she'd be taking her life into her hands, and reasonably that terrified her. But Mordecai didn't give up. He warned her. Verse 13 and 14, then Mordecai commanded to answer Esther, think not with thyself that thou shalt escape in the king's house more than all the Jews. For if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall there be an enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. But thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. And who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Esther, you're not guaranteed to escape this persecution. You're not exempt. The commandment goes to every Jewish person, and you could be caught up in that. But if you won't go to the king, God will preserve us somehow. But Esther, what if you are in the kingdom? What if God has placed you in these circumstances which you would not have chosen for yourself? What if he's placed you here because he knows you can make a difference for the Jewish people? What if God has placed you here in Kissimmee? What if he's placed you in your neighborhood, in your trailer park, in that grocery store? What if he's placed you in that moment so that you can tell someone about Christ? We can't just go through life just bulldozing. We have to keep aware that God has ordained. He's put situations into our life. And sometimes we get so frustrated when things go wrong that we forget to look for why it went wrong. Sometimes God's using it to get our attention, say, hey, there's somebody I want you to encourage. Hey, there's something I want you to grow in. The circumstances are out of our control, but we can still choose to trust God through them. Mordecai pled. He persuaded Esther. Esther, in verse 15, bade them return to Mordecai with this answer. Go, gather together all the Jews that are present in Shushan, and fast ye for me, and neither eat nor drink thee 3 days, night or day. I also and my maidens will fast likewise, and so will I go in unto the king. which is not according to the law. And if I perish, I perish. Mordecai and Esther at this point only had one hope. And that was that God was somehow going to work in this situation. They both knew that if God didn't do something, Esther would be dead. And essentially that was their last hope. But even as important as this decision was, even though this deadline that the Jewish people would soon be murdered was pressing in on them, they didn't rush. Esther took 3 days fasting, preparing for that day, no doubt praying. When you get into a desperate situation, the worst thing you can do is react quickly. Take time. It's uncomfortable. But if you make an impulsive decision that you think will get you out of the trouble, it often lands you into a different trouble. And you end up in a vicious cycle of constantly in a bad position. But if you just wait, if you just rely on God, as uncomfortable as it is, it will eventually get you where you need to go. Well, those days passed. Those 3 days perhaps passed way too quickly for Esther. Maybe the dire situation made it feel like an eternity. Maybe it felt like they didn't pass. Maybe she's just like, it feels like 3 months. I know what I'm about to do. Maybe Esther spent those 3 days hoping that the king might be like, hey, I need to see my queen. But he didn't call for her. And now Esther has to go to the king. So she walks into the court. You can kind of picture the scene. A lot of tension would fill the air. Suddenly the queen is where she is not supposed to be. But the king looks at her. And perhaps he's just like, who's that? Oh, that's my wife. And he holds out a scepter to her. Can you imagine that sigh of relief? The relief that you're no longer going to die. And he's feeling generous today. The king may have forgotten he had a wife for the last 33 days. But man, he looked at her and he's like, whoa, did I ever score on this one? Esther, I've got a proposition for you. He says in verse 3, what wilt thou, Queen Esther? What do you want? What are you here for? What's your request? It shall even be given to thee to the half of the kingdom. Well, that's generous. Esther, she's still patient. She didn't ask for half the kingdom. But she did make one simple request. Could you, King Ahasuerus, you and Haman, can you come to a banquet that I've prepared? Take notes. It's genius. The way to a man's heart is through his belly. King Ahasuerus, I need you to come eat with me. I need you to spend some time. You and Haman. Let's come to a banquet. So they agree. They go to that banquet. They have a great time. But somehow the king still isn't convinced that Esther has really told him what she wants. He's like, I don't trust this. She doesn't just want quality time with me. So he asked her again in chapter 5, verse 6. And the king said unto Esther at the banquet of wine, what is thy petition? And it shall be granted thee. And what is thy request? Even to the half of the kingdom. It shall be performed. Again, that offer, up to half the kingdom. Esther remains patient. And she simply says, can you just come back to another banquet that I'll prepare tomorrow? And when you come to that banquet, I'll tell you what I desire. Well, Haman is thrilled. He just had dinner with the queen, and he's going back. And he goes back home and he's just like, oh, this is the best day ever. And he's ready to tell absolutely everyone. Chapter 5, verse 9. Then went Haman forth that day joyful and with a glad heart. And when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he stood not up nor moved for him, he was full of indignation against Mordecai. You ever been having the greatest day of your life and then you see someone and you're like, oh, you exist. Well, that's unfortunate. Now my day's ruined. I met you. Well, that's kind of the day Haman was having. The greatest day of his life, and then he meets Mordecai, and he's reminded, oh yeah, I hate you. All that wrath steals all that joy he just had, and he's like, you know what? Whatever. You're just Mordecai. You'll be out of my way soon. Whatever. Nevertheless, Haman refrained himself. And when he came home, he sent and he called for his friends and Zeresh, his wife. And he's ready. He's just like, all right, guys, it is time for you to hear what I just did. Verse 11, and Haman told them of the glory of his riches and the multitude of his children, all the things wherein the king had promoted him, and how he had advanced above the princes and servants of the king. You can just feel the pride just radiating off of him. Like, oh, look at all I have. I am truly the greatest thing since sliced bread. And Haman said, moreover, yea, Esther the queen did let no man come in with the king unto the banquet that she prepared but myself. And tomorrow am I invited unto her also with the king. Nobody was welcome but me, guys. Dinner date with the king and queen, and only I was invited. And better yet, I'm invited again tomorrow. I am the greatest thing ever. And then in verse 14, well, not quite there. I forgot one thing, but there's a problem. Then Haman remembers, but Mordecai. I met Mordecai, and he's just the worst. And then he gets some advice from his wife, Zeresh, verse 14. Then said Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends unto him, let the gallows be made of 50 cubits high. And tomorrow speak thou unto the king, that Mordecai may be hanged thereon. Then go in merrily with the king unto the banquet. And the thing pleased Haman, and he caused the gallows to be made. Think how fast that was. Like, he literally came back from a meal, was like, oh, this is awesome. But Mordecai, and they're like, well, you could make 50-foot gallows. And he was like, I could, and I will. And overnight, he builds these massive gallows, and he's prepared. He's like, all right, I'm going to talk to the king, and the king obviously loves me, because why else would I be invited to go to a banquet with just him? And I'm going to ask for Mordecai to be murdered just early. He's too much trouble. But Haman forgot to account for one thing. And that's that God's always in control. And God had prepared a special sleepless night for the king. That very night, the one where Haman would have come, where he did come into the court that very night, waiting for the first moment he could talk to the king. That very night, the king couldn't sleep. So he asked his servants to bring him the book of the records of the Chronicles and read them to him. Essentially, he wants them to bore him to sleep. If the king can't sleep, neither can you. Now read. And so they start reading these records. And through that, the king is reminded about Mordecai, how Mordecai saved his life. And he's like, did we ever reward Mordecai? Did we ever give him anything for saving my life? And it's like, no, we in fact did not give anything to Mordecai. And the king was like, no, we've got to change that. We've got to fix this. This isn't some small thing. He saved my life. So he asked, I hear someone in the court. Who's in the court? Haman? Perfect. Bring him in. I need to ask him a question. So in chapter 6, verse 6, he comes in. So Haman came in, and the king said unto him, what shall be done unto the man whom the king delighteth to honor? And for sake of time, I'm going to rush through this. But Haman's just like, well, who is there to like more than me? King, I got a great idea. Give him your royal clothes. Give him your horse. Give him your clothes, and give him one of your top officials. And have them go throughout this And have them go to Mordecai personally, and then take him throughout the city, proclaiming that thus it be done to the man whom the king delighteth to honor. Man, do I have the best ideas or what? And king loved the plan. He's like, Haman, do it. He's like, what? Yes. Yeah, do all that you said. Don't even miss a single detail. Yes. And take Mordecai the Jew, so you know the guy at my gate, take him and do all you said. What? You can feel the shock. Not Mordecai. I was just going to ask you to kill him. This isn't good. He's enraged. And he goes back to tell them, his family, this horrible thing has happened. And Zeresh tells him, this isn't a good sign. If this has started, there's no way you're prevailing over Mordecai. They once encouraged Haman to rise up against Mordecai, and now they're telling him, no, this is bad news. Well, that second feast comes, that second banquet comes, and the king gets to it pretty quickly. What is thy petition, Queen Esther? And it shall be granted thee. And what is thy request? And it shall be performed, even to the half of the kingdom. Verse 3, chapter 7. Then Esther the queen answered and said, if I have found favor in thy sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. For we are sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be slain, and to perish. But if we had been sold for bondmen and bondwomen, I had held my tongue, although the enemy could not countervail the king's damage. And the king wants to know, who's attacking my queen? Who's trying to take her life? Who's trying to take the life of her people? Esther answers in verse 6, and Esther said, the adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman. And then Haman was afraid before the king and queen. King was filled with wrath. He gets up. He goes to the garden. Haman knows his moments are numbered. He knows he's in huge trouble, that the king is going to be filled with fury. And so he desperately leaps at Esther, pleading, do something. But the king comes in and sees Haman, and he's just filled with anger at the sight of him, that he would seemingly attack his queen. Verse 8, then the king returned out of the palace garden to the place of the banquet of the wine, and Haman was fallen upon the bed whereof Esther was. Then the king said, will he force the queen also before me in the house? And as the word went out of the king's mouth, they covered his face. They basically hid Haman's face so the king wouldn't have to see him anymore. They took him away. And we find out later that the gallows that Haman had intended for Mordecai were now his own, and he was hanged upon them. Mordecai and Esther hadn't chosen their circumstances. They hadn't chosen this captivity. They hadn't chosen that Esther's parents wouldn't be there. They hadn't chosen that the plot against the king would be there, that Mordecai would take that chance to intervene. They didn't choose that Haman would make this great attack toward the Jewish people, but they didn't sit idly by. They did what they could. They did what was right, even when it meant death. And within these next 2 minutes, lastly, we'll see that Mordecai and Esther were not distracted by the destruction of Haman. The destruction of Haman was not Mordecai's and Esther's goal. While he was an obstacle and the Lord saw it fit to take him out, the real issue was the decree against the Jewish people, giving basically license to murder every Jewish person and take all their spoil. In chapter 8, Esther comes to the king again and says, if it please the king, and I have found favor in his sight, and the things seem right before the king, and I be pleasing in his eyes, let it be written to reverse the letters devised by Haman. Haman had intended to destroy them, and Esther just wants those letters to be reversed. Can we take that out? But there's a problem. The law of the Persians can't be undone. Once it's written, it's set into stone. But fortunately, they can add. So while the king can't just say, no, I can't stop what I allowed to be written. But Mordecai, who is now promoted, you guys can write something that will help save the Jewish people. And they take the time, and they do. Don't be distracted when your obstacles suddenly disappear. The obstacles are not our focus. Haman, though the instrument of destruction, was not the focus of Esther and Mordecai. They sought to undo the damage. They sought to undo what he had written. Yes, they had to show to the king that Haman was evil, was wicked, but their ultimate goal was to save the Jewish people. Don't be distracted by the obstacles in your life when they suddenly disappear and you're just like, life's easy now. I can coast again. You need to stay on top of things. You need to stay focused on serving the Lord, because you don't want to become your own obstacle. You don't want to distract yourself from seeking what is best. And then, like the Jewish people did at the end of the book of Esther, they created a feast called Purim, where they would remember year after year after year. Sounds a lot like Thanksgiving. But they would remember year after year what God had done to deliver the Jewish people. And the Jewish people still celebrate Purim to this day, remembering that God delivers. Mark those moments in your life where God delivered you from an impossible situation, where you could do nothing to save yourself, but you kept doing what was right, and he worked in a way that just made everything right. And remember those moments. Don't just pray in the storm. Pray in gratitude after that storm. Well, I'm out of time, so we're going to pray, and we're going to prepare for this morning's service. Dear Lord, thank you for this day, and thank you for this opportunity that we've got to see a really quick, over-the-top view of the book of Esther, seeing how you worked through them to save the Jewish people. And I pray as we go throughout our lives that we're looking for those opportunities, that we're not so focused on the negativity of our circumstances or the greatness of them, that we're not looking for the ways that you would have us help others, to serve others, to be grateful. Pray that we won't be distracted as we walk through the week, but that we always seek to serve you first and foremost. Pray this all in Jesus' name. Amen.